My name is Mary Filardo, and I'm Executive Director of the 21st Century School Fund, which is a not-for-profit. Actually started here in the District of Columbia about 25 years ago when my kids were in 1926 elementary school here in DC that was pretty much falling down. It'll look like some of the pictures that you'll see. But we want to welcome you all. We're going to talk about really what we think the roles and the needs are for a federal role in what is essentially a local responsibility, but one where there's a lot of needs. So we're going to do some introductions of our panel very briefly, and then I'm going to go over a sort of a graduate level, but quick, sort of some of the data and facts to help frame the scale on school infrastructure so people get a context for it. We're going to hear from the panel from a real variety of perspectives, and then Stephen Ward at the end is going to work with us on sort of where we are now on the policy and politics of this, and we'd really love to have questions and discussion associated with what we're hearing. We have a lot that we're going to try to cover, so if there's quick question of clarification, somebody wants to just say, wait, what's that? I don't get that. Happy to do it, but we're going to try to move this pretty quickly. Okay, go ahead. Oh, I have this, don't I? Yeah, I think. The 21st Century School Fund, along with the Center for Cities and Schools and the National Council on School Facilities and the Center for Green Schools of the U.S. Green Building Council, got together a couple of years ago to create a new coalition, which is really a combination of civic, government, industry, and labor. What we know is that the infrastructure challenges are big enough and they're broad enough that it's going to take really a whole diverse community to address it. And so, we welcome you to look at the resources on buildusschools.org, and you'll see, these are just some of the members of the coalition. So first, before I get started, why don't we just do a quick intro, just name and social security number. No. Name and organization.
I'm Jerry Roseman. I work as the Director of Environmental Science for Teachers Union in Philadelphia and Environmental Science Advisor for a parent environmental group coalition.
I'm Zach Scott. I'm the Senior Manager of Federal Engagement and Outreach for the National Association of Secondary School Principals.
I'm Robert Boyd. I'm the Executive Director of the Secure Schools Alliance.
I'm Adrienne Dayton. I'm Vice President of Communications and Education for the Education Market Association.
I'm Brian Kennedy, and I'm with the Bricklayer.
Brian Howard with the U.S. Green Building Council.
Stephen Ward with VH Strategies. We help with the legislative side of the program.
Get that? So the first thing, I don't know how easy these are to see, actually. I'm looking from here and thinking I can't read that. But I know what it says. So one of the first things I think is really important to understand is, we think of schools attached to our community in our elementary school, middle, high school, whatever. But there are actually 100,000 of these public schools nationwide. And in fact, 50, almost 60 million adults and children are in these buildings every day. So there's a lot of our population, almost 1/6 of the U.S. population that uses these buildings on a regular basis. And we were trying to figure out how to convey the amount of space associated with that, and it turns out that it's about 2,800 Empire State Buildings, right, in terms of the square footage. But it's about 7.5 billion gross square feet of space for people who think in terms of size and buildings. Another way to think about how big this industry is, in a sense, is, I'm going to skip to the bottom one, is the current replacement value. So what's the value of this built infrastructure? And using an average of about $250 a square foot, the value of it is about $2 trillion. So if you think about, my apartment here in the District of Columbia, it could be be hundreds of thousands. But we're talking about 2 trillion in the nation's public school infrastructure. Another way to think about scale is how does it compare to other infrastructure? And this is where, go to the next one. When you look at the US Census of Governments and their reporting on public finance, this is capital outlay. So capital is on the finance side, your operating is on your annual budget side. So these are kind of important distinctions because we're primarily talking about capital investment here. So K-12 is about 24% of all of the capital outlay that state and local governments spend. This is not on the federal side, this is just state and local government. And what you can see is if you add higher ed into that, it's actually more than highways. So it's a very large part of state and local finance. And you can see, you know, there's utilities, parks and recreation, solid waste, water, all of those really important infrastructure pieces, which we absolutely support investing in. But it's critically important that we don't leave the schools out of this equation. Whoops. So part of the reason for needing a federal role is the scale of it, but also the level of need that we're looking at, and particularly as it relates to the inequities that you find from one district to another. See if I can, I know there's one in here. There it is. So you know, basically what are the needs? Part of what we've got, the same thing we have with roads and bridges and waterworks, we have old infrastructure, which isn't bad in and of itself, but it does mean that it has, you know, it deteriorates over time. And what we know is over half of the schools need some kind of repair. And the facilities actually have taken on a bigger and bigger role in communities over time. They've always had an important role, but you know, they're shelters, they're voting places, they're, you know, the children in after-school programs, there's millions of them that are there after school and in the summer, whether it's for feeding programs, other kinds of activities. In the last 50 years, which is roughly the average age of the schools, a lot has changed. In lead, used to be perfectly legal to put in your pipes and in your paint, not anymore. Asbestos, fabulous material for insulation. Oh, guess what? Not legal to use anymore. PCBs, there's any number of materials that were one time considered safe and usable that are no longer usable. New norms, ADA accessibility. You have to give people a right of access, not just to the building, but with the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, you have to give them access to programs. So enrollment has changed. There's millions more kids. What was interesting, there's the boom from 95 to 2013, more growth in enrollment than the baby boom from 1965 to 95. So there's a lot of change. Technology, right? 50 years ago, let me tell you, they were not, I was in school 50 years ago, there were not computers. And then, you know, we've learned a lot about energy use and the importance of conserving natural resources. So much has changed. And for that burden, or not really a burden, because it's just a responsibility to be on the part of individual district communities, what we know is they're just not quite doing it. The other thing that you'll hear about from Robert, you know, clearly our world of safety and security has changed. And so the requirements for that are very different. Oops. And what all of that has come to mean is that we have a gap in what the states and locals have been able to do and what really their responsibilities are. And we estimate that on the maintenance and operations and capital side at about $46 billion. But really, what we're going to talk about today is the capital side, which is $38 billion. So here is I know, this is what I wanted you all to see. So our data, which we did in the stateofourschools.org, you can get it, we worked very closely with Center for Green Schools on this report. And so you can see the tall column is essentially using a 4% replacement value. So let me see. So this is, think of this as a body mass index, right? This is a measure of sort of what should you weigh, what should you be spending in order to keep your buildings in good repair. So on the capital side, we're working with industry and officials. We're seeing that a 4% of that current replacement value, that's the 2 trillion, remember? So 4% of that, you can do the rough math, 80 billion a year is what should be spent. Okay, let's see. So that's the tall column. What you see, the next column down where it goes like that, is the 20-year average of what states and districts actually were spending. So nationally, from 1994 to 2013, we were actually spending, our states and local districts, about $49 billion a year in 2014 dollars. So it's a real effort on the part of the public. Now what you see in those next 3 columns is FY14, FY15, so fiscal year 14, fiscal year 15, and fiscal year 16. So what you see is that in the most recent years that there's data from the US Census of Governments on, that we were not actually even maintaining the 20-year average, which was already at a $38 billion gap. So, and one of the things, again, people are like, well, you know, then they need to try harder, you know, it's local responsibility. So at the end of fiscal year 16, the local school districts, no state debt, just local debt, was $434 billion, okay? So when people say, oh, what's the pay for, we can't afford to pay for it up here, well, okay, they're already carrying $434 billion in debt. And $18 billion a year in just the interest payments on that long-term debt. So that is more than federal Title I, right? Just to give you, again, the scale on this. Now, part of the problem, if we all shared in this problem equally, it would be, you know, it's a problem, but it's a little bit different kind of problem. In fact, some of the school buildings that kids are going in are fabulous. They're beautiful. They are more than to code and healthy and safe. But there are others that you will see in a minute that right now today are not fit for occupancy, frankly. And part of this is because of the system that we have that funds school facilities. It's different than the way the operating budget. So the operating budget is sort of the annual teachers, you know, it's actually custodians, utilities, it's some part of facilities, but it's also the, you know, just regular operations. On the capital side is when you have to build a new building. That's not built into an annual school budget. It's borrowed and then paid back over years. So this pie chart shows you, on the left chart, it shows you that roughly states pay half, you know, 45%. Local districts on average are paying 45% of their annual budget, and the federal government contributes about 10% of every annual education budget. On the other side, what you're seeing is that the local share per capital, if you've got to build a new school, 82% is coming from the local district, and only about 18 on average come from the states. And in 12 states, they don't do anything. So this is sort of, again, the national average. So part of what, you're not supposed to be able to see this, what I want you to know is that we have essentially this data for every state. We got it at the district level, we rolled it up to the state level, and you'll be able to see, you know, what's the square footage of your state, how much money is being spent in your states. And part of what we wanted to make sure that from a staff perspective is that we think you really need to educate yourselves so that the members actually know the scale of what they're working with and what they're being asked to decide on. So this was the other thing that we've done, is we have taken the data and we've looked at it by congressional district. but this is more of a challenge. But what we also wanted you to know is that we looked at all the congressional districts and how many schools are in them. Usually at least 100 schools. So there are hundreds of schools that are in your congressional districts. And there are thousands of children. Most of them had well over 100,000 children who live in their congressional districts. Now, this is Texas 32. And the problem with it is, of course, you know, these congressional districts are kind of strangely shaped. And the school districts themselves are kind of strangely shaped, quite honestly, for some of the same reasons. But, so it's a little hard to get the one-to-one relationship, but we thought it was important, and we have a list and we can post it, but every congressional district, how many schools, how many districts they serve, and what the districts are, and then how many children are in each of those districts, including how many charter schools are in each of those districts. So anyway, so I'm going to stop now, and yes?
On your data set, do you have details on the particular needs of each school?
So what we have is we took that body mass index and we did a comparison of what they have actually spent compared to their inventory and what would be recommended to be spent. And that gap does vary considerably, and we have that by state and by school district.
Is that a lump sum or is that per feature?
No, that is a lump sum, and there's one of the things, and it's in the Rebuild America School Act, which is important. The data on this is, you know, this work is almost forensic to do. There's not, even states, many of them don't have state level data on their facilities. They have it on their schools, but not their buildings. So this is one of the challenges of this. So I want to turn it now to our panelists, and they're sort of grouped into, these are our folks that deal with the school's life and the conditions and the challenges in the buildings. And then our next panel, the three starting with Adrian and Brian, are really sort of looking at the schools in the context of the economy and the sort of the broader issues that they very closely interact with. So Jerry, why don't you go ahead and...
Am I coming up or here? Is this good here?
I think you're okay there.
Okay. All right.
No, it's hard to do the clicker actually.
Okay. Well, I introduced myself. I think I'm the forensic guy. I work at the school level, and my work for these last number of years, I think, reflects the dual nature of what we're facing. Capital, major infrastructure, maintenance and operations. They're not separable, really. If we don't do capital improvement and modernization, maintenance costs rise dramatically. If we don't do maintenance, capital costs rise dramatically. And so you're going to see, I think, how they go together very closely. So 2 hats for me with the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers, an 11,000 person union, and the Philadelphia Healthy Schools Initiative, an 80 organization coalition with maybe 250,000 individual members in those different organizations. Environmental advocates and parent groups and neighborhood associations. I also play 2 roles with respect to the Board of Education and the school district in Philadelphia. One is as a critical friend and partner to the district working on system policies, and the other as a public stakeholder watchdog. So there's some tension there all the time. And you can see in this photo where some of this tension comes about, because I also work at 2 levels, at a granular or a micro level, in the schools on an almost everyday basis. I document conditions, I take photos. I measure and test and talk to people in the buildings, and I write reports and I include recommendations. And I do that as both this critical friend partner, but as a watchdog stakeholder. And I grew up in Philadelphia. I've lived there my whole life. I went to school there. I have kids who live in this city still. And these issues for me are not so academic and theoretical. Seeing these conditions each day makes me frustrated It makes me sad, and it also makes me angry a lot of times when I'm seeing this. This piece of what we're going to be looking at, and I may ask Mary to look back to these a bit, is they're very powerful visuals. They're visceral, really, in terms of being able to move something along. And I also see these two parts of the K-12 landscape. The long-term modernization that is needed and is essential, and also taking care of the here and the now. This is where our kids live, that's now, and the staff. So if in a district like Philadelphia, the $8 billion that they might need was given tomorrow, and was in the bank, and was going to be used in the best and most perfect kind of way, we have 10 to 20 years of time when our kids are in settings like this, and we have to figure out what to do. That what to do seems to be a triage, stabilization kind of effort. That's the maintenance and operation piece. What do we do, when, and where, and how? And in looking at some of these images, I think we'll be able to tease that apart. So let's turn to them now. And Mary, if you go back to that first one just for a second, what you see here is something that reflects the lack of capital improvement and maintenance. This is food preparation, that's flaking lead paint. It's in the hallway, and this happens because we haven't had the rebuilding of this 75-year-old structure or the modernization and expansion of it. There's no room for cafeteria space, and the paint has deteriorated over years. And so you have what's essentially a perfect storm here of flaking lead paint over food prep. This also shows a lead paint problem, but from moisture intrusion in a closet where books were damaged. We don't have the ability, many schools across the country don't replace educational materials that get damaged like this.
I'm going to keep moving a little faster, Jerry, because we're at 3.5 minutes. Go ahead.
We recently, there was a situation where a child, and this is the child, was burned, had a second-degree burn on his face from coming in contact with that heating pipe that radiates at 200 degrees. The issue here is that this kind of condition exists throughout many of our schools and across the country. It's easy to fix, easy to identify, easy to fix. You should never have anybody burned. But we don't have the capacity often and the planning to do this in the right way. When it gets a little bit bigger, we have the situations you see on the photos on the two left-hand photos, where there's wild mold growth over thousands of square feet, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix because the capital improvement into the ventilation systems was not put, and so they don't function properly, and we don't have the maintenance and the training to then manage them in place, the systems we do have, and we end up with that. The third photo shows a massive flood that happened because of a clogged roof drain, the same kind of thing. We know they exist, we know it was going to be a rainstorm, and there's a long weekend, but nobody's able to respond to these things up front. We also sometimes miss issues that occur because they're in mechanical spaces. No kids are at risk, so we let these things go until kids are at risk, and that's what happened here. And then the $300 fix became a $30,000 fix. The same in the next photo, the one before this, I think, Mary. No, okay, I'm sorry. You can go. This photo. This is in an educational space. This is a science classroom recently seen in a high school. There was a slow drip on that radiator there that has been there for 3 or 4 years. It was fixable for $20 and in 15 minutes, but it was a very small leak. And it never rises to the level of somebody coming out because there's always a bigger leak until it causes mold and damage to the asbestos tile. And now that $20 fix is a $4,000 fix that displaces people for a week. Similar kind of situation in a library in a low-wealth community in Philadelphia. Parents put a lot of money in to redo the library. That's what you see on the left. The lack of training and resources on behalf of the maintenance staff allowed a steam leak to continue. And what you saw on the right were the fruits of that leak that closed that library for the season. And finally, one of the ways that we're trying to tackle this, and we think that this is something that is expandable beyond Philadelphia, is we developed a mobile application that can be used to allow teachers, parents, anybody to describe what they're seeing in the school, to record it, to take photos, and to push it to the union, which then shares it with the school district, and we've gotten some amazing results through this process. Hundreds of people have been using it, and this is a way to engage the voices of the people who are directly impacted in the schools.
Is that how you got the mouse?
That's how they got that, yeah. I mean, one of the things that we do is vet these photos and make sure that these are legitimate photos. This one looked almost too good to believe, but this is a reflection of the kinds of things that people are facing. These are not cherry-picked images, they're not one-off kind of images. This is a prevalent and widespread type of condition.
Thanks, Jerry.
You're welcome.
Zach?
Up on there is Jerry's next really scary picture of what can happen.
That's why he came in.
Yeah, you know.
He did send a video.
I actually want to start with my next slide, Mary, just sharing a quote from the Department of Education. I'm not going to read it to everybody. You guys all work in Congress. You're smart. But really the main idea here is that we, in our U.S. Department of Education, acknowledges that infrastructure is pivotal in student development and educator effectiveness. But I want to take this one step further. Infrastructure has a very big impact on culture and the climate of a school. So school leaders and staff members, along with the community members and leaders, have a shared responsibility to ensure that schools are safe, orderly, kids feel comfortable coming to school. You feel loved, you feel cared for. That's the best way for them to succeed. But the people I represent, principals, they actually take that one step further. The principals are they have the main responsibility of creating that climate and that culture in that school. So that's a really big piece of what they do, and well-maintained and appealing infrastructure is a very beneficial factor for principals in this endeavor. Now, unfortunately, as Jerry just pointed out to a lot of us, especially in underserved communities or low-income communities, this is already an uphill climb, and it's going to be really difficult. My association, the National Association of Secondary School Principals, or NASSP, because we don't have an hour for me to say that constantly, we recognize just how influential infrastructure is for students' learning ability. I'm just going to read, we actually have a school facilities position statement. I'm reading a quick quote from it. Ensuring safe and healthy and modern public school facilities that can support innovative teaching and personalization is a crucial component to closing the achievement gap, increasing academic achievement and graduation rates, and ensuring all students have access to effective teachers and school leaders. I really like that quote, one, because I helped write it, but that's a little besides that, because it highlights one issue that's really overlooked when we discuss school infrastructure that Jerry just did an excellent job of highlighting, which is equity, and how we are failing to provide equitable learning conditions for all students, especially those from underserved populations. So we actually go to the next slide. I don't have really sad pictures, I just have words. So as you can see though, students of color and low-income students are having to deal with worse infrastructure than their higher-income peers. So we see this across the nation. Unfortunately, it leads to a trickle-down effect of other issues that influence their learning ability in a negative way. So one of the largest issues that arises from poor school infrastructure that we have seen from our members and that they have noticed is actually teacher and principal turnover. Surveys have been done in Chicago public schools and in DC itself that teachers consider their school to be in poor physical condition. They're more likely not just to leave that school, to leave that profession altogether. If you can go into any location and tell me they have a surplus of teachers, I'm going to tell you it's imagination land because I don't believe it exists. NASSP, so going beyond that too, with principals, we recently teamed up with the Learning Policy Institute to do studies on principal turnover, or as we call it, principal churn. And we found out one of the 5 key factors for a principal leaving or staying in their school are their working conditions. Now, principals are more likely to leave schools with higher percentages of low-income families, students of color, and low-performing students. Obviously, one of the main factors probably is this poor infrastructure. It's just a constant cycle that we're feeding these underserved populations and not fixing. Now, teacher and principal turnover has detrimental effects when we look at student achievement. A Vanderbilt study recently came out that found that losing a teacher during the school year is linked to the loss between 32 to 72 instructional days for that student. 32 days is about a sixth of the school year. 72 is right around your half. So imagine so already students already have summer break where we know they lose a lot of that learning that they had from the year before. Imagine losing another half a year of schooling. You're basically treading water. You're not making it anywhere. We also have research from the Laws Foundation, speaking from a principal standpoint a little bit. Whenever a principal goes into a school, they typically have a vision. That's what the principal is there for. They direct the school to that vision. I would say it's like a new coach of a football team. If you're going to go in there and put a West Coast pass offense in, and you used to run the I formation for everybody who really likes football here, it's going to be a big change for you. It's going to take a couple of years, 2 to 3 years. I see a couple people shaking heads, a couple fans out there. It's going to take 2 or 3 years for you really to be able to implement that. For a principal, it's about 5 years to get your vision implemented in your school. It's not a short chunk of time. So we've seen that typically principals in these lower performing schools are leaving about 2 to 3 years in. So they leave that school, and then a new principal comes in. That school starts all over with that new vision. Because very rarely are you going to get a principal that picks up where the last one left off and goes, yeah, I like all those ideas. I should do the same thing. So then, once again, we're leaving these schools in a constant flux, and they just can never get the traction enough to get to where they need to be able to be successful. So we really need the federal support to come in there and fill that gap. Otherwise, we're going to keep seeing educator shortages and just equity that just continues to permeate our nation's schools.
Robert?
Cool, so what's a security guy doing here talking about infrastructure? Full disclosure, I've actually built a school complex, so some of the comments I'm going to make are based on experience. About the Alliance, I actually work for Mary, she's on our board. We have a lot of partners. It's rare we go to events like this that we don't have multiple board members. You can go to our website and see who some of them are and who our partner organizations are, like Claire's and Zach's. But about the Alliance, we focus solely on improving the security infrastructure, security technology, and life safety systems of America's K-12 public schools. We recognize that secure schools need to be safe and healthy to have a positive impact on students and teachers, the kind of stuff that Zach was talking about. Safe means that we oppose any solution that makes a school secure by violating life safety codes and laws that serve the handicapped and the disabled, such as ADA. We don't like barricade devices. They're not safe. Healthy means we want to see safe and secure solutions applied to school facilities that are free from environmental hazards and have working systems. We put it this way, it's dumb to put locks on a door where the roof is leaking, there's lead in the drinking water, and the heat doesn't work. In Texas, we call that putting lipstick on a pig. We also support economically sound decision-making, which includes the notion that it's going to be less costly to improve the safety and security of the school when it's part of an overall security project than when it's a one-off. We also like master contracts to bring costs down, and some of our corporate sponsors don't particularly care for that. Let's whip through the next slide if we can. Mary's already teed up the scope of the problem. What she didn't say is that the American Society of Facility Engineers rates our school infrastructure at a D+. Doesn't get much worse than that. And Zach has already talked about poor and substandard school buildings negatively affect the health of children and adults in schools, which in turn negatively affects their academic and job performance. The school climate and equals academic achievement, and positive social relations are also critical to academic achievement. Facility quality is also key in shaping that school's climate. But our problem is most of our schools were built before we had studies on the critical roles of facilities and what they play in education. So how does that affect security? 100% of the mass incidents in elementary schools and 35% of the mass incidents in secondary schools were committed by intruders. We know how to keep intruders out of a building. If we keep the intruders out of our elementary schools, no more Sandy Hooks. Parkland, he was an intruder. He had already been pushed out of the system. We can argue and talk about what the impacts of pushing him out of the system, not giving him help are, but the fact remains he was an intruder. He had no business being in the complex. So if we keep the intruders out of the secondary schools, no more Parklands. This is the 20th Remembrance Week of Columbine. 65% of the mass incidents in secondary schools were committed by the students. 65% of all public schools have reported incidents of violence in their schools. Facility quality plays a strong role in shaping the school's social climate, but facilities are only part of the solution. but they do play a major role. Don't let anybody tell you that they don't. Let's talk for a second about costs. Partner Alliance for Safer Schools, one of our colleague organizations, has guesstimated that it would take about $100,000 per elementary school to bring them to a basic level of security. I'm just talking about fundamental stuff, locks on the doors, an access control system so that intruders don't get into the building. It's a campus, a fence around the campus, basic stuff. And we know secondary schools are larger. They guesstimated about $170,000 per school. Those numbers are assuming they have nothing. Just keep that in mind. Congress, though, has long held that the responsibility for school buildings rests with local governments. In fact, there hasn't been a major federal investment in school infrastructure since the Eisenhower administration. I was born in the Eisenhower administration. That's the 1950s. Last year, many organizations came together to support the Stop School Violence Act. And while a small investment, about $25 the first year, $30 million, $33 million going forward, it nonetheless represented an acknowledgement on the part of your bosses that they have a role in school infrastructure. They focused solely on security, but they acknowledged they have a role in infrastructure. So don't let them tell you the federal government has no role. But here's a breakdown of where that $25 million went. It was 24.5 they gave out last year. The average grant size was $269,000. 91 grants were given. They covered about 5,380 of the 100,000 schools, and it was spread across 44 states, reaching only 3 million students. The things they asked for were mostly cameras, target hardening equipment, and technology. One of the comments, Zach and I, this is our second one in a week, we'll do another one for DOJ in a couple of weeks as they get ready to go through their next grant funding round. And one of the points we want to make is some of these schools are so old and they're asking for state-of-the-art camera systems, and they don't have the IT infrastructure to support it. Or they're made out of cinder blocks, and the type of internet that they're using in the building doesn't permeate those walls, or the radio waves don't get through those walls. So they have to be aware of what the school is asking for and whether or not it's the right application for that school. So think about those things. They're important to the overall infrastructure, but if we fix a school, we will also take care of the safety and security of that school. Architects are really good at that. So.
Thank you, Robert.
Sandra Green, I'm representing the Education Market Association, and we are the leading organization connecting people who want to succeed in the education market. EdMarket represents companies of all sizes that produce and deliver nearly every type of product you find in an education environment. So that's everything from classroom window treatments to creative flooring, to flexible seating and instructional materials. So it runs the whole gamut there. EdMarket provides advanced resources and leadership to those who serve education, from the manufacturers and distributors who are outfitting schools across the country, to the architects, facility planners, and administrators who are planning the future-based educational environments. Our annual conference at Spaces is for people who design, create, and equip engaging and inspiring learning environments. So we kind of bring all those people together talking about the future of educational facilities. When our organization heard about the excellent work being done by BASIC to raise awareness of the growing need for improved learning environments, of course, we were all in and excited to be part of this effort. Because we think everybody, of course, needs a safe, modern, and healthy learning environment. Every child in America deserves to attend a school like those pictured here. This is what 21st century schools should look like, with students who are empowered and where innovation is the norm. We know high-quality school buildings facilitate high-quality education. And of course, parents want first-rate education for their children, actively seek homes in good school districts. A new or renovated school provides not only economic benefits to homeowners in terms of increased residential property values and thus tax revenues, but a high-value learning experience for students. A new or renovated school provides a substantial positive effect on home prices, leading to increases in populations of families with children attending our public schools. So it's all very important. The failing physical conditions of the nation's public schools present an opportunity for high-quality jobs in the fields of architecture, construction, manufacturing, distribution of the construction materials, and educational supplies in the classrooms. School construction projects employ a range of professionals from subcontractors, electricians, plumbers, roofers, carpenters, HVAC specialists, and data and communications experts, who are all working to ensure that campuses are equipped for 21st century learning. There are the direct jobs, which are the construction and tradesmen who work on site. There's the indirect jobs, including the product manufacturers, distributors, and installers. And then there are induced jobs, and these jobs are created when more working families are now able to buy additional food, houses, cars, because they now have income from working on a construction of the school. So a federal investment in educational facilities would provide the same economic benefit as when a school district passes bonds for much needed renovation and construction. Our members actively follow those districts that have recently passed bonds and bring the expertise, new product innovations, and cutting-edge ideas to these projects. School construction puts money right back into the local economy. When hiring local people for building renovation projects, school districts are putting those dollars right back into the pockets of the taxpayers who support the public schools, creating a win-win for the industry and the entire community. Besides the broad economic benefits associated with construction, national research consistently links school building upgrades to measurable positive impacts on both students and the community. We know that aging schools not only face increased repair and maintenance needs, but are also unable to accommodate new instructional technologies and modern educational programs that we've discussed. So the Education Market Association stands in full support of an increased federal investment in school facilities improvement as part of the infrastructure bills going through Congress. Appreciate this opportunity to share.
Thank you. One of the subs you forgot was the bricklayers, Ryan.
Well, I think I can mention
I
that.
think you
So, I just want to thank you all for being here. It's nice to see this much interest in this important issue, and even if you just came for the free lunch, thanks for being here.
Thanks for staying.
I want to talk a little bit more about the jobs impact of a significant investment in rebuilding our schools. I think the panel's done a great job on describing how serious the need is and how our government at every level has failed to address those needs. And on behalf of the bricklayers, I would say that we believe the primary reason we need to invest in our schools is because students and teachers deserve to go to schools that are safe and conducive to learning. But it's also to note that there's an important jobs impact of the kind of investment that we're talking about. And Bobby Scott has introduced the Rebuild America Schools Act. Senator Reid has introduced companion legislation in the Senate. It's a $100 billion investment, and that level of investment is estimated to produce close to 2 million jobs. That's a significant increase in jobs. Those are direct jobs. And bricklayers, we represent bricklayers, stonemasons, block people who work on tiling, and the flooring in this building and a lot of the house buildings is a material called terrazzo, which is very sturdy flooring material. You'll see it in buildings like this, in airports and schools. So if you've ever been in a school, you know there's a lot of brick and block and tile. So obviously there's a parochial reason why we're concerned, because a lot of those jobs will go to our members. But it's not just our members who benefit, the communities benefit, and other construction industries, and also material companies. I have a letter here, and I had a few from the North American Concrete Alliance. It's a trade association that represents a number of entities that produce the materials we use in our work. And the economic benefits aren't just directly to our members, it trickles into the economy. They're good jobs, and that creates demand in the local economy, and it's a benefit to everyone. I also wanted to point out the legislation that's been introduced has over 180 co-sponsors in the House. All of those co-sponsors are Democrats. But it's not only Democrats who recognize the need to invest in our schools. And last year we worked on a letter with Congressman Joyce from Ohio, who's a Republican. It was signed by 15 other Republicans. And I just want to read one paragraph in it. It says, To help schools modernize deteriorating facilities, the federal government should partner with states to find innovative funding mechanisms and ensure adequate funding for schools in all communities, whether they are urban, low-income, suburban, or rural. Investing in our school infrastructure will advance student academic achievement, spur job growth, and stimulate innovation. So there's strong bipartisan recognition for the need to invest, and now we need to work together to find a route towards making that kind of investment.
Thank you. Brian?
Hi, folks. My name is Brian Howard again, U.S. Green Building Council. For folks who are getting a cool background, we're best known as the folks who do LEED certification. I'm usually not known for projecting so well, so I apologize for doing such a good job about it. So USGBC is a national nonprofit organization. We consist of about somewhere under 10,000 member organizations. That's anybody from a local government to a contractor to an architect, all sorts of various different folks in the product supply chain, as well as those who are designing, operating, and maintaining facilities. And our goal is simply put to try to maintain, better design, operate facilities. The way that we primarily do that is through our rating system, which is known as the LEED certification system. Maybe some folks have seen those logos every now and again. We would like more of those around, so we're working on that. But to date, we're very successful in that process. We've done about, today we'll certify about 1.85 million square feet of real estate. That includes school facilities. We do work in every state, as well as over 160 countries nowadays. So we have done a lot in that process. We certify those folks, but we also accredit professionals. So we also provide core competency in education and training and those outcomes. And we're close to about 200,000 accredited professionals across the world. So those have folks who have demonstrated competency in performance and high performance facilities to be part of that chain of activities. So a number of my colleagues have already talked about some of the things that are on my first slide. So I just want to focus a little bit more on some of the environmental resource benefit issues, as well as some of the job creation issues. So one of the things that I think is really important about the work that we do, and LEED is known as this thing, but it has a number of other reference points to it. So it looks at having minimum prerequisites as it relates to energy efficiency, water efficiency, indoor air quality, sites and resources, materials and things of that kind. So it's not just one element of efficiency and you've got a really great building. We try to make sure that it's an integrated approach, that it's looking at a number of different design features, and then trying to maximize benefits and thinking in an integrated process. So this has been pretty popular in the sense of things that it gets to a point where we get very significant environmental benefits. And again, people have been seeing the value proposition of that. I wanted to share a few different reports that have been done from state and local governments that have been showing the benefit side of that. So in 2016, the Washington State Department of Environmental Enterprise Services, which is kind of like Washington State's GSA, did a look at their 29 LEED buildings and found, and those include education facilities, that they reduced their energy use by an average of 37% over a non-certified facility. So those are pretty significant savings. Again, I'm not sure how much you guys are paying on your utility bills. I would be happy to pay 37% less and do whatever it is that I want to do with that, whether that's, want to go out to a nice dinner, or I want to buy new clothes, or I want to pay off the credit card. School facilities think in the same way, but probably more like I want to invest in my teachers. I want to buy, more education supplies. I want to do some of those things. We've also seen some of the same, studies bear out as it relates to another local government in Nashville, who looked at 20 of their facilities, which include education facilities, and found that their LEED certified buildings avoided energy costs at about $500,000 and saved about almost $10 million, or 10 million gallons of water versus their non-certified building. So if you care about resource conservation and the associated benefits of energy reductions, then that's probably good in and of itself. If you also care about some of the other elements of what happens as a precursor of that, so that maybe you reduce emissions, maybe you get some of those things anyway, just a food for thought issue in terms of some of the co-benefits of what modernization and what upgrading facilities and what building good facilities get you at the minimum side, and then some of the other co-benefit issues. And we've already talked about some of the learning issues, we've talked about some of the safety issues, we've talked about some of the economic issues. But I do want to spend a little time about talking through some of the economic issues as well. And I guess this is one of the elements that, I want to spend a little bit more time on some issues as it relates to resilience and durability, and then go into some economic issues. But we've also seen that a number of, we've had some academic research from the University of Texas in San Antonio that's reviewed all of our credits and all of our strategies in our rating system, and they found that about 65% of all those credits deal with resilience against flooding, and it's about the similar amount as it deals with hurricanes or typhoons. So if you're doing some of those strategies, if you're bundling some of those things up, you're again getting some benefit to make sure that you're dealing with a durable, resilient activity. Hasn't been mentioned thus far, but school facilities tend to be a shelter in place for communities as they're dealing with natural disasters. So having a facility in place that's able to actually weather and resist natural disasters of that kind are also important. So, and I think we've seen that kind of proof bearing out in terms of our market activity. So for the last 2 years, my colleague Anissa, who's over in the back, and she can wave at you, has done some data crunching in terms of what the economic contribution of LEED certification looks like. And we're seeing about, in terms of the investment of education facilities writ large, it's about 10% per year. So every year we're seeing about a 10% contribution of education facilities in the United States are going through that certification process. And in some instances, that's because state and local governments have policies in place that support LEED certification, or that they are doing it because it is a rational economic advantage that is saving them resources, and again, having some of the co-benefits of whether it's increased property values, whether it's increased safety and security, whether it's again, attractiveness and retention for education. There's a lot of different purposes for that. There's 2 states I want to highlight. We'll do Ohio first. Are there any Buckeyes in the room? Oh, Ohio.
I think we, since we're at 5 minutes left,
Okay.
I want to make sure.
I will just say one quick thing about it, that in Ohio, since they've had a policy in place for about 10 years, they've spent about approximately $1.4 billion to purchase materials within kind of the Ohio market region in terms of being able to support and modernize schools. That's one state, but they've been doing that for quite some time, and we've seen a lot of economic activity as well as environmental savings on top of that. So for all considerations, we're going to go through those things. So thank you.
And Stephen Ward is next. We're going to talk about this board, but I also want to invite folks who can stay and have more of a discussion. We'll take questions and do that, but we want to make sure that Stephen has a chance to talk to us about, okay, how do we get where we might need to go? Yeah.
I'll wrap quick. So it's my job to wrap up and in the end ask for your help. As you've heard throughout the briefing, far too many of our nation's schools are crumbling, literally, and major systems in them are failing. The result is too many teachers teach in, and too many students are trying to learn in schools that present significant barriers to learning and real threats to health and safety. We also learned that the problem is not evenly distributed across the states, nor is it evenly distributed across any individual state. It's largely concentrated in the lowest wealth communities, most often in very rural or inner city communities, but often in mid-sized towns and even in suburbs that are still lagging behind the rest of the nation and recovering from the last decade's recession. And those communities are not able to solve this problem on their own, which is why we're talking about a federal investment helping with that. From a public policy point of view, there is good news. It's not easy to see, so I'll try and replay it here. The public recognizes the problem. Recent polling suggests that regardless of party identification, significant majorities consider improving our school buildings a priority. Taking a quick look at the data, for Republicans, improving school buildings falls only slightly behind roads and bridges, with 68% of Republicans stating that improving school buildings is extremely or very important. But for both independents and Democrats, improving school buildings polls higher than any other infrastructure investment. And I guess I would conclude, having worked in the Senate for a lot of years, as on many issues, the public is ahead of many of our elected officials in terms of their perceptions. So where are we today? We visited over 148 offices to educate and recruit supporters. We have 2 matching bills, House and Senate bills, which I can describe in some detail. If there's a question about them, there's a slide on it next, but I think for the purpose of keeping time here, we'll skip that. But both of those bills propose a modest but significant federal investment to leverage an already massive annual spend on school buildings that's coming from the local and the state level. We have Democratic leadership in the House and Senate that have proposed including a major investment in school buildings as part of their infrastructure plan. We have a modest number of Republican House and Senate members who have called for addressing the issue in whatever package Congress produces. And most of the offices that we visited, Republicans and Democrats, agree that the problem is dire and would consider a modest federal investment. That's the description of the bill, so I think for the purpose of time, we'll skip it. So finally, where does this leave us? There's still a number of unanswered questions about the overall infrastructure plan and schools within it. So what will the scope of the infrastructure package be, and will it include school buildings? What will the scale in terms of the size of the investment in this infrastructure package be? And what will the scale, if we get schools in it, what will the scale of that investment be for schools? We do know, just to reiterate, that we're underspending by nearly $40+ billion a year on school buildings, and we're not proposing a federal takeover, only a modest federal investment which can help leverage available local and state dollars. Question, will the plan include direct spending and incentives, in what ratio? What's clear for these local communities that are the lowest wealth is that they need a direct spend. They need direct capital spending. So our goal here, and I guess finally, how is the plan going to be funded? Will it be fully funded, and where will those funds come from? Where will the offset come from? Our goal is to ensure that the infrastructure package that comes out of Congress includes a major investment in school buildings, a big chunk of which we hope will be direct spending to states, targeted on the schools in the worst condition and the districts least able to meet the need on their own. To get there, we need your help. We need help to retain the commitment of the Democratic leadership in both chambers, and we need help in recruiting Republican support in both chambers, but especially in the Senate.
Thank you. Well, that was 1:30, but are there questions, comments? You know, that was I said, a graduate level class. That was a lot. We will post the presentation on buildusschools.org, so you'll be able to see it. And I think Karina has taped it, so you know, we know that you're going to want to share this with folks, or all of your friends who missed it. But let me just make sure if there's any questions, comments. Yes.
Hi.
Introduce yourself first.
My name is Rachel. I'm involved in all things green and sustainable, and I'm a writer. I'm wondering how the Green New Deal would play into any of the infrastructure, if that's been any kind of discussion of the infrastructure of building schools, especially through comments from U.S. Green Building Council, and then from the gentleman from the Philadelphia Teachers Union, or Federation, sorry. Just what could that possibly look like, or has that even been considered in your pathways to coming to Capitol Hill today?
So thanks for the question. I think with regards to the Green New Deal, I certainly think the discussion and the amount of debate that initiative has brought about has really been interesting, to be able to create a dialogue about how we move forward in terms of doing modernization and infrastructure and doing it in a sustainable way. And I think for us, whether it's the work that Congressman or Chairman Scott and Senator Reid have been working on in terms of doing school facility infrastructure in a sustainable way, to us that's the dialogue we want to have, not necessarily of how green the Green New Deal should be or not, but rather what are the solutions that the discussion around the Green New Deal creates, if that makes sense. So for us, we're really excited about what let's have a Green New Deal, and by doing that we should do X, Y, and Z. And for us, X, Y, and Z includes school facility modernization in a sustainable way, which Chairman Scott and Senator Reid's bills do.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not sure that we have plugged that in a very formal way into the way that we've been thinking about the work that we're seeing specifically. But what happens for us is we push constantly to have practices put into place that protect everybody in the building. That is energy efficient, but also clean water and clean air in the buildings. There's a push often for protections to both the environment outside and inside the building during construction activities. for instance, in the release of organic vapors from all kinds of construction. And a big focus of the inspection work that we do and the assessment is related to what are essentially green issues. So I think that's how we are interacting with them right now.
Yeah, is there any other questions, comments? Otherwise, we'll be here, and anybody who wants to come up and chat, that would be fine. But I think we'll close now, thank you.